We've created our form. We've modified it through the Properties panel in terms of changing the size, changing the text, which affects the title on the window or the form, and we changed the back color. Now we're going to build our interface by adding some controls or some instances of objects. Controls are visual objects that is used for user interaction. And oftentimes we're displaying things in terms of the output, we're gathering input with these controls, or maybe providing instructions. If you remember back to our storyboard for this calculator, we had 3 text boxes, 2 of which would be used for input and 1 for output, which is going to be the solution. We had 4 buttons for doing the 4 different mathematical operations, and then we had some labels for identifying what each of the text boxes were and giving some instructions to the user. So on the form, I'm going to come over to the toolbox, and I'm going to start with the text boxes. So I'm going to scroll down here in the toolbox and find the text box object or text box control. And I'm going to simply select that, come over here to my form, and I'm going to drag a box going from one diagonal corner to the opposite corner. And that text box now is on my form and it is selected. I have 2 handles here at each end, and in the Properties panel you'll see that I'm now looking at text box 1, and it is of type text box, and then here's all the properties associated with the text box. The properties of a text box may share some of the same properties as a form, but they'll also have a lot of different properties the form does not have, and vice versa. The first thing I'm going to do with this text box is name it. By default, the text box has a name of text box 1. If we were to create another text box, it would be text box 2. And these names aren't very descriptive, and if we have a bunch of text boxes, it'd be hard to remember which text box is used for which purpose. So anything we're going to refer to in code, which we're going to do a bit later, should have a unique name that is meaningful. I'm going to name this text box txt first num. Now I'm using what's called camel casing here. I'm starting with lowercase, and the first 3 letters are txt, which is Hungarian notation that says this is a text box. You don't have to name your text box this way, but it's pretty much an industry standard in Visual Basic. I tend to do the same thing in C#. Most C# programmers probably do not use Hungarian notation. The names of objects can only be one word, so I can't have any spaces in here or any special characters. But what I do is I capitalize the first letter then of each subsequent word, and that's where we get the camel casing, this little hump of the first letter. So txt first num is somewhat descriptive, and it tells me that this is a text box. I'm going to scroll down in the properties and change a couple other things. I'm going to add some text to this text box. So we're going to the text property, and we'll put in a default value here of 12. I press the enter key, and you'll see 12 appears in the text box. Now for numbers, I like to have them aligned to the right. So I'm going to change the text align property, and this is sort of like the color in that there's a drop down palette, and I'm going to choose right. And you'll see the number 12 now has jumped to the right. I'm also going to change the text or the font a little bit by going to the font property. Now I notice the font property has a little arrow over here on the left. That means it consists of several sub-properties. I can click on that arrow and see all the sub-properties here. What I'm going to change is the name, and I don't have to look at those sub-properties. I can go back to the font and click just this little button over here on the right. It has 3 ellipses, which is a programming standard, means it's going to bring up a dialog box. So it's going to bring up a dialog box, which is the standard font dialog that you would be familiar with in other programs. And by default, I'm using a Microsoft Sans Serif font, regular. I'm going to make this a little larger. Let's go 14 point. And I'm going to click OK. So it's a little bit larger font. I might want to adjust the size of my text box here after the fact, and I can just grab that handle and just drag it a little bit so I can visually size it. I could also change the size property in the Properties panel. Now I'm going to have a label on top of that. So I'm going to go to the toolbox, choose the label control, and I'm going to drag a little label above that text box. Labels are static text. The text cannot be selected or modified by the user. We can modify it in code, but it's static text where text boxes can be dynamic. I'm going to change the text property here to simply say first number. And when I press the enter key, you'll see it changes that in the label. And you can use the arrow keys on the keyboard to nudge items. There is a grid that things tend to snap to, and you can modify that grid in the Tools Options menu choice. So now I have the label and a text box created. I'm not going to name the label or change the name. The default is label 1. Now I don't change it because I'm not going to refer to it in code. So I can name it if I want, but if I'm not referred to in code, I don't take the time to do that. I'm going to click on the text box, hold down the Shift key, and click on the label, which will select both of those items. Then I'm going to go to the Edit menu and choose Copy. Go to Edit menu and choose Paste. And now I have a second text box and second label. I'm going to position those over here to the right. I'm going to click on the label and change that text to second number. And for my text box, I want to rename that to say txt second num. And I'm going to change the text property to 5. I'm going to paste again. Change the label of this third set, say solution for the text. And then the text box, I'm going to name txt solution. I'm going to add a label in between the second number and the solution. The text is just going to be an equal sign. And I'm going to make the font much larger. Drag it into place. And then I'm going to add a button. Create the button the same way as I did the text box, choosing the button control and dragging a little square. I'm going to change the text here to just be a plus sign. And I want that to be a little bit larger as well, so I'm going to change the font to a larger size. I'm going to resize that button a little bit. I'm going to name this one BTN Add. I'm going to copy it using Control-C, Control-V to paste, position it in place. We'll name the second instance BTN Subtract. Change the text to a minus sign. We're going to paste again. Change the text here to an uppercase X. Change the name to BTN Multiply. By the way, the name property is actually in parentheses, so it appears at the top of the list when it's alphabetized. And I'm going to paste one more time. This would be the division. So we'll name this one BTN Division. BTN Divide either way. And I'm going to change the text here to a slash. Now I'm going to add another label. I'm going to do this one a little bit differently in that I can just simply drag a label and position it. I'm going to change the text here, and I've actually copied the text from my storyboard. I'm just going to paste it in. And notice that in this case the label extends as far as it needs to go off the edge of my form. I'm going to select my label, and I'm going to go up to the auto size property, and by default it is set to true. That means it's going to change the width of this label to fit whatever the text is. I prefer to have this set to false. So I'm going to set it to false, and now the size of that label is much smaller and my text doesn't fit. I'm just going to drag out the handle. I noticed that when I pasted the text, I lost some of the text that I wanted there, so I'm going to go back and copy that text, come back in, make some changes here to the text property. By the way, if you click on the text property value, there's a drop down arrow here. It brings up a little dialog box. So if you have a lot of text, it's usually easier to work with it in this dialog box. And now I've got the instructions that I wanted. My form is now done. I've created the user interface. My objects that I'm going to refer to in code are all named. And the next step will be creating the code.